There you go. All right. Let's go, David.
Great. Thank you, Zulema. And welcome, everybody, Agents of Impact. I'm David Bank. I'm the editor of Impact Alpha. It's great to see so many of you on the call. I think we had close to 250 RSVPs, and I know there's a lot of interest in this topic and so much talent represented among all of you. So why don't you preserve our tradition and go ahead and introduce yourselves on the chat. Obviously, say who you are and your organization, but also maybe where you're coming from geographically and what your connection is to housing, and in particular, housing preservation, which is the theme of today's call. At the top, I want to say thank you to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, a longtime supporter of our Muni Impact coverage. Many of you have been on some of those calls, and now our broader coverage of investment strategies, expanding equitable opportunities for health and wealth. And we have, and we'll introduce in a minute, Ruth Gao from Robert Wood Johnson, and we've been working closely with the team with Kimberly Cornett and Zoila Jennings, and they've been great partners, and thank you. Let me bring in my colleague and co-host, Dennis Price, coming to us, I think, from Austin, Texas.
Hi, David. Good to be here.
You spent the weekend at Austin City Limits, I think, Dennis?
We did. Still recovering, but an annual tradition.
You've been helping Impact Alpha get up to speed on this on the housing agenda, and frankly, housing has been coming up on the national agenda.
There was
a little color on that.
There was a great stat, I believe a Washington Post journalist dug up, that the last VP presidential debate, housing was mentioned 32 times. That's more than the last three VP debates combined, which of course was 0. So it's on people's minds for sure.
Yeah, and it's home buyers, renters, retirees, and what we're going to focus on today is, there's obviously a huge need for new affordable housing, and a massive gap there. But there's also a sort of underappreciated need to preserve the affordable housing that already exists. And so today's theme is preservation, and it also goes across rental housing as well as home ownership, and then various slices in between that we'll get into.
Yeah, I mean, and then the models we'll discuss on the call today, we're learning there's just a lot more tools in the toolkit. I think most people think, and then those tools are and those strategies are increasingly investable or fundable. So excited to dig on that. And ownership in particular, in its various forms, community, individual, is turning out to be a powerful tool for both affordable housing preservation and wealth creation for low-income residents that have been sort of cut out of, not able to access the traditional market.
Yeah, and ownership has become a big theme for us, and more broadly, the ownership economy has arrived, we declared a few weeks ago. So let's dig in and let's introduce our guests. Michael Lohmeier, Chief Investment Officer of Impact Community Capital. Welcome.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Dennis, for having me today. I look forward to the conversation. Really excited to be here. This is my first time, I think, participating, so take it easy on me, and I hopefully will meet your expectations.
Terrific. We had your colleague Jeff Brenner on our podcast a couple of weeks ago. So we've been following Impact Community Capital for many years. So thank you for joining. And Ruth Gao, Associate General Counsel at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Welcome, Ruth. Oops, we lost Ruth. She seemed to freeze up there. Well, she'll come back, hopefully join back up. But let's jump to Paul Bradley, founder and CEO of Rock USA, resident-owned communities. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, David. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And you're coming to us, I believe, from Concord, Mass., if I recall?
Concord, New Hampshire.
Concord, New Hampshire. Sorry, you probably get that a lot.
Historic Concord, you bet.
Okay, sorry about that. And Jazmin Segura from the Counsel Foundation, Director of Strategic Initiatives for Housing Justice. Welcome, Jazmin.
Thank you for having me. And I'm calling from LA, California.
My hometown.
There you go.
And Devin Culbertson at the Grounded Solutions Network. Welcome, Devin.
Hey, David, thank you. Happy to be here.
And you're coming to us from.
So I'm typically from Austin, Texas. Today I'm in Minneapolis for a work retreat and looking at a portfolio we just invested in. So we'll talk more about that soon.
Oh, terrific. On the ground. So terrific. Well, I hope Ruth will join us, but let's get started, Michael, with you. And I kind of queued it up, housing, affordable housing preservation. And I've been very taken, I think, by this kind of quiet and sort of slow building crisis of the expiration of rent restrictions on housing built, a number of years ago. Now those terms are coming up. Can you just give us the brief on what the situation is and what's at stake?
Sure, and thank you. And some of these statistics will probably be well known by some of the participants. I was looking at the chat, and a lot of really experienced people here today. So apologize if I take this at a higher level for a moment. According to a lot of studies and research that we've done, particularly with Census Bureau data and HUD data, just in 2025, 200,000 units are looking to expire from use restrictions tied to low-income housing tax credits, HUD loans, or Section 8 properties. And that number is expected to grow to almost 1 million units a year by like 2032, 2033. And so that's the scale of the problem. When you start thinking about it, a couple of other points just to kind of set the stage. The US has about 50 million rental units in total across the country. Only about 10% of those have restrictions, even in the most densely populated. Use restrictions are not common. What is common in the US rental market, of course, are smaller buildings. So, one of the things we have to offset some of these conversations with is something like 40% of the units are in buildings less than 4 units. So, you can kind of take them off. That's a different policy problem. But for the larger buildings and the larger units, we have a significant expiring use restriction problem. And then you tie that with the other facts about affordability and rent burden. And, every year the National Low-Income Housing Coalition does a gap report. They release it in March if you want to wait up for it. It's kind of like, the NCAA tournament, and then the gap report comes out. But it's bleak in terms of we need about 7 million units just to meet 2024 demand, to make sure that the renters across the US aren't rent burdened, and rent burden typically means paying more than 30% of their income. And so if you take into account that we're losing 250,000 units a year, we have this significant undersupply of units, and we don't build a lot. I know that's not the focus of today's call, but affordable rental production is 100 to 150,000 units a year. You have a real problem. And that's kind of the scope and scale. And so it takes creativity by lenders and by the development community to preserve these deals. And that's what we've focused on with some of our more recent programs.
Okay, so just to understand, the rent restrictions were put in place in return for low-income housing tax credits, Section 8 subsidies, various kinds of programs. They have a term, sometimes I think in the case of the low-income housing tax credit, 30 years. Some of these buildings were built 30 years ago. They come off restriction, then they can go market rate. Developers like that, buy it up, hike the rates.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially kind of like the life cycle, right? So we invest as a society right into these buildings, and we put restrictions on tied to those subsidy programs. And then in many cases, it's 15, 20 years later, those subsidies have been repaid or have been used, and the property typically is sold. And those are the opportunities where market rate developers look at it and say, look, I've got this apartment building, it's in reasonably good condition, I can raise rents, and I can purchase it. And so one of the problems in the market is that market rate financiers have access to capital that's fast. They have cash, or they have access, to lines of credit and other things through their banking and financial institutions. And mission-aligned investors need access to the same things. They need access to cash quickly so that they can bid on properties and then hold them. Because one of the challenges is that affordable housing isn't easy. If it were, none of us would probably be on this call. But it's hard to pull together all of the resources that you need to maintain affordability and then to extend the use restrictions or the rent restrictions for another 20, 30 years. And developers need that time. And so that's what the market needs, is they need access to cash fast, and they need time to hold these to put together the financing packages.
I think that's going to be a kind of theme of the call, is not just a sort of amount of capital, but it's kind of speed and flexibility and access, as you said, quickly to Capital. And just give us the brief. I mean, first of all, your solution is a kind of bridge financing, as I understand it, so that these developers can move fast and then refinance with I'm sure the federal money and other things moves much more slowly.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've done a couple years ago, around the time of actually COVID. It wasn't the best time to start a new strategy, but actually it turned out to work quite well. We began a bridge loan program where we work with a network of lenders across the country who have relationships with mission-aligned developers and owners. And we provide them bridge loans, that are relatively quick, standardized terms. We'll do up to a 5-year hold with no prepayment restrictions. They're interest only. And what that does is that allows them then to apply for, tax credits or tax exempt bonds or agency takeout mortgages. And those programs in some states are highly competitive. And so there's no guarantee that, 6 months later, you're going to be putting together your financing package. So they don't need a 12-month bridge or a 24-month bridge. They need something longer and flexible to give them the time to work through the various strategies.
Right. And I know Impact Community Capital, I think main business has been actually financing new affordable housing as well. So you're on both preservation and construction or creation. But one of the things that's interesting, particularly about you guys, is that your backers and your original, I think, founders were insurance companies that are sitting on large pools of capital, wanted to put it to work, and are looking for competitive market rate returns, and have found it in affordable housing. So just tell us about how this has become kind of an institutional asset class.
Sure. I think insurance companies are kind of known for their commercial real estate exposure. They do a lot of it. And what they can't do, though, are find the deals that are unique, bespoke is a word I like to use, maybe overused a little bit. And that's their challenge. So insurance companies invest in equity and debt and commercial real estate broadly in the market rate world. They're used to doing big trophy properties, right? But they like the risk return profile of affordable because of the restrictions and the unmet demand in the marketplace. Affordable properties are stable cash flowing properties. They typically, if you're focused on mission and the income level and serving your tenants, they're not going to have excessive returns from an equity perspective or a debt perspective, but they're low risk and they pay their mortgages. And so they like it. But what they couldn't do through their ordinary channels of how they allocate capital and invest is they couldn't find enough of it, because there's a few large deals that get done, but most of the stuff, our bridge program, the average loan size is 10 million. On our permanent mortgage side, the taxable mortgage side, the average loan size is 3 million. And so if you get a sense for that scale and the complexity of understanding all these government programs, they're not well suited to do it. So they created us and then have continued to invest in us over the last 25 years because it's the way they can get access to a product they like. And honestly, I think they would do more if the marketplace supported a greater amount of preservation opportunities and new construction opportunities.
Terrific. Okay, well, that's a good place to leave that and to jump to Ruth, because it's not only preserving rental housing, as we said, but also preserving ownership opportunities and home ownership. And Ruth, thanks for rejoining. You froze up there for a moment, so thanks for coming back. Dennis, do you want to?
Yeah, Ruth, and also home ownership preservation. You had a great piece in SSIR this week or last week, where you talked about philanthropists and funders have long had programs around home ownership for low-income communities, but that it's time to put home ownership preservation on the agenda. Why now for Robert Wood Johnson?
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Dennis. You can hear me, all right? So, as the nation's largest philanthropy focused on improving health and health equity, we see financial security and wealth as key drivers of health and health outcomes. And home ownership, your home, is typically the largest asset and source of wealth for families. And in order to advance health equity for all families, we are looking at addressing the racial wealth gap, right? Mm-hmm. And so as we've previewed already, part of the equation is increasing new home ownership, where we have seen traditionally philanthropic efforts targeting. But we've also seen data after doing some research and scans, data that show that families are actually losing homes at approximately the same rates as the increase in new home ownership. And so, in other words, if you look at the racial home ownership gap, that has actually not closed, but actually widened in the last 60 years. So for us then, it's critical to look at this other part of the equation, which is to help families with existing properties to preserve the assets, to unlock and fully utilize the benefits of owning property, and to be able to pass it down to future generations. And so that's become a key strategy for us. And we're trying to tackle it in 4 main ways that families tend to lose their homes, right? Which include home repair or often disrepair, the lack of affordable insurance coverage, foreclosure prevention, and tangled titles.
Yeah, and then the SSIR piece, you dug into tangled titles a bit. Help us understand that issue and why it particularly affects Black and brown families in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So tangled titles arise when a property owner passes their home or land down to multiple heirs without a clear title. And that often means a parent dies without a will or an estate, and their home by law passes down to multiple children. And those children may not engage in a legal process called probate to officially transfer the title. And this ambiguity creates a challenging legal situation where now all of the children are tenants in common, which means they hold ownership interest in the same property. So it's not a divisible interest. And so then if one person wants to sell that property, but the others don't agree, the property can't be sold. On the flip side, if disaster hits, up until very recently, FEMA and other federal disaster relief programs, they require a clear title in order to receive federal aid, which means that if you have an unclear or tangled title that many heirs property households have, they are left out of disaster relief.
What are
Yeah.
the remedies to that? I mean, there's education and whatnot, but it seems like you might have family disputes that are sort of, immune to remedies.
Yeah. So, we've seen a lot of households be subject to predatory practices where a predatory investor takes advantage essentially of one family member who maybe does not live on the family land or moved away or just is in need of cash. So they buy their interest for cash, probably at very deflated or undervalued property value. And what you can do is when there is a dispute over a property, you can enter a process called partition. And essentially either you divide the property in some way, but oftentimes for a family home, it's impossible to divide between multiple people in an equitable manner. And so that forces it into a partition sale. And you can see that often will lead to really disparate and extractive outcomes for the families and the members who live on that land. And that kind of goes back to the original question of the disproportionate impact on Black and brown families. Black and brown families have much lower will making and estate planning rates than white families. And so more often than not, their property gets passed down with a tangled title or as heirs property. And with this, the partition sales and other historical policies, there's been a distrust of local authorities and governments where their properties get sold to the local sheriff or the local attorney sees an opportunity and it essentially forces families off the land. So, there are a lot of ways to look at this, right? It's looking at how can we provide funding to support clearing cost, the cost to clearing title? How can we build more trust or build better policies to support families and protect them from predatory practices? How can we bring, there's a disproportionate representation, right, of Black and Brown attorneys who are in the estate planning practice. So how can we educate more attorneys who can go and represent the populations that are most often affected? So those are some of the ways.
Ruth, you mentioned in the piece the role of CDFIs, community development financial institutions. What are some of the what are some of the products that a CDFI might offer, a financial product, to address some of this?
Yeah, and that's something we're actively trying to figure out and work on. We've got a few grants out now to pilot or test and solutions, but there are also some CDFIs that have been working with their communities who face, potential loss of property due to disrepair, tangled title, partition act. And so there may be, financial products that we can create that don't rely on a title, right? That don't rely on collateral with the property. There could also be ways to look at tackling bundling home repair loans with title clearing costs, right? And so I think CDFIs are the best position to understand the community and the needs of that community, and to be the first responders, really, in terms of when a family comes looking for a home repair loan is often when they find out that they don't have clear title. And so to educate the consumer, to educate the property owner.
I'm curious about the response to your piece. Is this something you think philanthropic funders or impact investors, you think this is a topic, a sector, a category of thing that they're going to have appetite for?
I absolutely hope so. I think when we look at these issues, it's not just the individual family that's affected, but oftentimes these effects ladder up to your block, to your neighborhood, to matters of racial equity, to home valuation, to wealth building. So this issue, I think, touches on so many other issues that we're all trying to work towards. And so I'm hoping that there's broader understanding of the issue and funding that goes into research, that goes into expanding legal clinics so that more students can learn about this issue, more direct services can be provided on the ground, and more funding eventually for financial products so that it's not just a donor activated type of issue, but that it's something that creates more autonomy and self-determination for the families. And it's not necessarily that one person owns the home, but it could be a collective ownership model. It could be, there are other ways to preserve that wealth and use it to generate additional wealth and revenue for families. So I'm really hoping that there will be wider uptake and interest in the field.
Thank you, Ruth. And Paul, I imagine some of this is resonating with you in the mobile home context, both, and let's just start with one of the things that Ruth raised, which is insurance coverage and also disasters. And I know that in both Helene and Hurricane Milton, mobile homes in particular were affected and often uninsured. And there's so I know that people don't often think of mobile home in this housing preservation context, but it's a huge chunk of the market. So just give us the lay of the land there.
Sure. In the Carolinas, David, 15% of the state's housing stock is manufactured or mobile homes, so not insignificant, 6% across the country.
And more so, obviously, in low income and communities as well. So, yeah.
America's lowest income homeowners sit in a very, poor position here, very vulnerable position, right? They own their homes and they rent the land beneath their homes from commercial investors. Historically, local developers and owners, and more recently, small, medium, and large private equity firms and REITs. So John Oliver called everybody's attention to this, and it's now widely known and widely recognized as a problem. But to your question, in terms of building on Ruth's comments, first I would just say, Ruth, thank you for your work and for Impact Alpha's work here. Housing stability, just basic housing stability, is underrated. Like if you don't have stable housing, you're not showing up to work. Your kids aren't showing up to school. You're not showing up at community meetings, engaged in your neighborhood. It is just fundamental, and it's a great place to start. But to the issues with Helene and Milton most recently, I'll take that up one notch, David, and just say, U.S. housing policy, programs and systems are entirely built around two basic silos, right? Multifamily rental and single-family home ownership. And here's a group of 3 million U.S. homeowners, primarily low income, that fall smack dab in between the two of those two silos. And you can imagine, from FEMA to HUD to all agencies, local, state, and federal, everyone argues, oh, you don't fit in our silo. You're more rental than single-family home ownership. And oh, you don't fit in our silo. You're more ownership than rental. So welcome to the gap, and that exists in insurance and FEMA coverage and all the way down the line.
Well, but the curse is the blessing in a sense. Ownership is a tool that you use and have used very effectively for many years to help get more stability and security for these homeowners, and I guess to come together as a co-op and buy the land that they're renting on, that they're previously renting on.
Yeah, exactly, David. For 40 years, it's starting in New Hampshire, and for the last 16 years nationally, we've been helping homeowners form limited equity cooperatives to buy the land beneath their homes and to operate as owners of their homes with one share in the cooperative that owns the land. And it's a remarkable record of success. These are some of the lowest income neighborhoods. Upwards of 50% of homeowners in co-ops are very low income, and just about 90% are low income. And yet these communities have been operating on a democratic basis with strength and resilience for 40 years. It's now a national network of 332 co-ops and 23,000 home sites. And we're in 21 states now with the model.
Now, to take it back to what Michael was talking about the need for capital to move quickly, you're in competition when these sometimes mom and pop, and you say now even sometimes private equity owned mobile home parks come up. There's many buyers for that, and including buyers who would either redevelop it into other kinds of uses or just raise rents or what have you. So how do you compete?
Yeah, great question. For 40 years, and it's still happening today, individual communities that sell and with a seller who's motivated to work with the homeowners, to sell to the homeowners, we've been incredibly effective at helping co-ops buy their properties, even from contract to closing, 120 days. And we've largely done that with CDFI debt. In what you would consider highly leveraged buyouts of these commercial assets. But a couple of things have occurred here, not the least of which rests at the feet of private equity that began really pouring into this sector after the 2008 meltdown. Lots of financially very sophisticated people who knew how to raise equity through syndications and funds began rolling in. They met in 2014 with an approval by the Federal Housing Finance Authority to allow Freddie Mac to begin competing with Fannie Mae to finance investors' purchases of communities. And it unleashed a skyrocketing of prices of communities. So, our work now is at the Rock USA side, very much in working with public-private partnerships, combining philanthropy, the public sector, banks, insurance companies, other CDFIs, to assemble the capital and the subsidies required to make co-op purchases affordable. So Rock USA is very deliberately building that across the country, you know, and it's local, county, state, and federal dollars that are coming in. And then to confront consolidation, which is, you know, these private equity players buy, raise rents, refinance, take the equity, buy again, rinse and repeat, right? So they've built up some pretty significant portfolios. And now when properties come on the market, half of the time it's within a portfolio. And so our strategy to resolve that, not unlike Grounded Solutions Partners, you know, that is so Rock USA has created Integrity Community Solutions, which will develop an equity fund to purchase portfolios, own them on an interim basis, and then sell them one by one to the homeowners. And it is exactly what Michael was talking about. It's prospective private equity fund, right? You need the capital in advance in order to belly up to the bar and negotiate on bulk or portfolio purchases. The air gets a little thinner, but the competition gets a little thinner up there. So that's where we need to get to.
And last question, we talked about the dual benefits. Obviously, there's a housing, a shelter benefit. Is there also a wealth creation benefit for the mobile homeowners?
Yeah, that's the beauty of what we're doing. It's a middle way strategy, David. So individual homeowners continue to own their homes. And in our basic model, they sell their homes into the marketplace for whatever value the market will place on it. The co-op itself is a limited equity co-op, actually fixed equity. Their membership interest does not appreciate, and there's no ability for the co-op to resell the land. So in our 40-year history with this model, we've had one co-op resell to the nonprofit from which they purchased, and otherwise every co-op still retains ownership. There will be 332 communities. At some point, this record will be broken, but for the time being, that's the record.
Thanks, Paul. Jazmin, let's continue on the community ownership theme. The Community Counsel Foundation works with low-income communities across the country on a number of issues, justice-related, and housing is a justice issue. Can you just share a bit about the families that you work with and the organizations you work with are experiencing housing challenges?
Sure. Thanks to you, Dennis, for that question. So I'm probably a unique voice in this panel. I come representing Coming Counsel Foundation, which is a social justice public foundation that works primarily with low-income and extremely low-income Black, Indigenous, and people of color across the country, although our housing work is very focused in California. And we never saw ourselves as a housing funder. We've always been an organizing, power-building social justice institution. However, in many of our conversations with our partners, when we were working on issues of criminal justice, immigration, environmental justice, education, any and all issue areas, housing sort of rose to the top as a primary issue area that communities in California were facing. And so there's a wide range of challenges that the communities are facing right now. Some of them that were already mentioned by our previous panelists, but I'll just highlight a couple. There's definitely a history of disinvestment and racist housing policies, such as redlining, that have kept or excluded people of color from home ownership and wealth building. This has deepened the disparities across the country. And just an example of this, in 2023, home ownership rates for Black Americans were 45.9%. For Latinos, we're 49.8% compared to 73.8% for white Americans. So this really highlights the stark contrasts and the racial gap disparities. I think Mike mentioned already, there's a lack of affordable housing. There's a severe shortage of affordable housing, particularly for low income and extremely low income levels. And the shortage, what we've seen in the communities that we work with, are forcing many families to live in overcrowded and substandard housing. Many of them are also trapped in this cycle of eviction, displacement, and leading into homelessness. Many low-income families are also severely rent burdened, meaning that they spend more than 50% of their income on rent, which leaves very little for basic needs like food, medical cost, transportation. It just really stretches people by paying a significant portion of their income on rent. And then what this means in like real people's lives, when I look at like here in California, where I'm calling from, or in LA, an extremely low income or very low income household could be making, this is for a family of four, could be making anywhere between $41,000 to $69,000 for a family of four. So you can imagine that a family on that income is having probably a really hard time thinking about home ownership pathways through the traditional pathways. And so, especially in one of the highest priced real estate markets in the country, home ownership is just unattainable for a lot of the communities that we work with.
There's this movement afoot, though, that you talk about around community-led initiatives, community land trust, housing cooperatives, some of what we've talked a bit about, shared equity models, that is working to ensure that residents access the benefits of the rising value of homes, even when they don't own them. Can you explain the role of these community organizations and how they play a role in preserving affordability and ownership?
Yeah. So for us, we see community ownership as a powerful preservation strategy because it really gets to the root of issues of making housing permanently affordable and democratically owned and governed by local residents. Community ownership models help preserve affordability by lowering barriers of entry for low income and extremely low income residents. I think these models are vehicles for low income residents to access permanently affordable housing. And for many, this is probably the only viable opportunity for home ownership and asset building. So we're talking about communities that would otherwise be shut off of opportunities from like traditional markets, traditional financing systems. So through models like community land trust or housing cooperatives, we ensure that rising home values benefit local communities rather than outside investors. And I'll share a little bit about like our work at Counsel Foundation. We're working primarily in supporting the capacity building of community land trust that I know, Devin, you'll probably get into it a lot more, but I won't go too much into the technicality elements of community land trust, but it really ensures permanent affordability by separating land ownership from like the land from the building. And this it's an innovative approach. And it really provides families the opportunity to be able to preserve affordable housing through these different models. And then one thing that I'll say specifically about community land trust in particular is that under community ownership, residents are not just homeowners or tenants, but they actually get to manage and govern the land and housing collectively. So the model really ensures that there is a community governed structure that ensures that decisions about the land and the housing serve the needs of the local community rather than the needs of outside investors.
So tell us about the community ownership for Community Power Fund and how that's playing a role here.
Yes. So in a couple, we've been doing this work for the last 2 years. The Community Ownership for Community Power Fund is a community governed pooled fund. So we pooled resources from different philanthropic institutions with an idea of supporting two strategies. The first strategy is around strengthening the capacity of community ownership organizations to acquire land and to store land. A lot of the organizations that we were working with had 2 staff members that were trying to do very complex acquisition projects that were like really limited in their capacity and their ability to scale their projects and scale their ability to acquire these projects. So then we provided core operating support grants to the multi-year grants. And to date, we funded 26 organizations and have dispersed over $5 million in core capacity building grants to organizations across the state. The second kind of element of the community ownership for Community Power Fund is to design an integrated capital investment fund that will make low-cost patient capital available to facilitate acquisition projects and rehab projects of our partners. So we're working with two very well-experienced CDFIs here in California that are helping, bringing in the technical expertise for us to be able to pilot this initial fund next year that would support the acquisition projects of the groups. And I'll say that this integrated capital fund intends to provide like vital investment at scale for community land trusts to grow their acquisitions and their projects. It would enable community land trusts to also leverage this investment and be able to unlock additional public resources and subsidies where available. And it also demonstrates, or we're hoping that it demonstrates, new pathways and products, financial products for banks, CDFIs, and foundations to invest in permanently affordable solutions for low-income families. So that's the intent of the Integrated Capital Fund, to meet the very unique needs of the communities that we're working with, as well as the community needs of the community ownership organizations.
Awesome, thank you. And there'll be lots of ways for folks on the call to plug into that as it develops, so keep us posted. Devin, Grounded Solutions Network also works with community ownership organizations or shared equity organizations, but you're now adding another element. You've recently launched the Homes for the Future Fund. Can you share a bit about that and how it works?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dennis. This is a great panel, and it's great to clean up, because so many of the key topics that undergird our work have been raised. So, for Grounded Solutions, we come out of a history of supporting community land trusts. We're up to about 250 members nationally in 46 states. We also work with Habitat affiliates that are trying to build out similar programs that have a shared equity component, and also governments that are doing similar work on the public sector side. And so we're really looking at how we grow the portfolios of these organizations to really build kind of an infrastructure that supports the health, wealth, and stability that folks have been talking about on across the panel. But as a membership network, folks were asking us, how can you help us be less dependent on the city NOFAs every year, on some of those subsidy sources? How can you help us grow that portfolio in different ways and at a faster rate? And so our emphasis has really been looking at the threat of private equity and the single family rental business that has really grown since the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis, and trying to turn that into an opportunity for low and middle income people. And so the Homes for the Future Fund is really an equity fund and subordinate capital and PRI pool that's really intended to go out and make direct acquisitions by leveraging that infrastructure that was built for private equity investment, to be fast, to be efficient, to bid on algorithms and aggregate those single family homes, to operate them incredibly cheaply and efficiently, but also maintain asset value because they're looking at the exit, right? And so all those things that we would want to do for our communities, we're building a capital pool to invest in and leverage that infrastructure. So we're buying single family homes and portfolios, and we're holding them as we build up equity over time. And once we amortize some of that capital and build up enough equity, those are being sold as kind of a feeder fund into the community land trust and the shared equity partners that we have in each place. And then and at that exit, we can then return that capital to investors.
So you said you're in Minneapolis today, where you made your first investment. Tell us a bit about it and what are the plans for that? Yeah.
So we really have sort of two investment lanes that we've been working through. One is really thinking about the space that Paul was talking about, where there are portfolios that are investor owned. At some point, they need to transact, and as those get larger, the buyer pool shrinks. And sometimes when you have those situations, you have a bigger bid ask spread, and there's some opportunities if you can be ready to buy. So we invested alongside a couple of other nonprofit GP and asset managers with about half a dozen philanthropic organizations here in the Twin Cities, and acquired that portfolio of 283 units 2 weeks ago. So that was our first investment. We are now looking at leaning into our role now that we've closed, which is really about transitioning as many of those homes as possible into the 7 land trusts that are here in the Twin Cities. About 195 of those 283 are in the footprints of those 7 CLTs. So we're starting right away to move those into ownership. And a lot of those are, as you would guess, concentrated in low income communities of color, in communities that are reverting from a lower price point to the mean more quickly, so they're appreciating faster than the rest of the city. So really capturing not just the stability and the anti-displacement and the ability to have folks stay in place there in those communities, but capture that wealth building potential for the current residents and those first owners, but do that in generational terms so that folks can, owner after owner after owner, can be in that place and have the opportunity to live in that community, do it affordably and build wealth while they do it.
Devin, when we spoke earlier, you just sort of brought this up, but that tension that sometimes exists between preserving affordability on the one hand, but then creating wealth for low-income communities on the other. How can we overcome that, and how does your model specifically address that?
Yeah, so the way that we're looking at that is that when we're passing on that discount and that increment that we've created through our ownership, we're really looking for stewardship organizations and community land trusts that have a resale formula that's going to retain that wealth in community over time. And so the way that typically works is primarily through a resale formula that restricts the resale price between the chain of owners. And so that allows folks to buy at an affordable price that's affordable for them and their family, that's got the consistency and the stability that comes with home ownership. They're able to amortize their loan as homeowners do and build equity in that way. And then the resale price will be restricted by a formula that's determined by each organization. So that's not dictated by us. And we have a calculator that helps folks choose whether that's going to be based on AMI growth, whether that's going to be based on CPI. But most commonly, it's actually just a fixed price or a fixed percentage, so that folks can really easily understand how that's going to change year over year over year. And it's easy to project forward. So that's typically maybe 1.5% or 2%, depending on the organization's choice. And that really creates this middle ground between staying generally in the range of AMI growth in a place, but allowing pretty robust wealth creation. Often we're seeing if folks are buying and holding on an average of 7 years or so, they're leaving with $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, which when you compare that to the average wealth of renters, as most folks on this call know, is 10, 20, 30 times where they were in terms of household assets just a few years prior.
And you have a great stat around how many folks are going through this process, coming out and entering the traditional market.
Yeah. So we one of the things that Grounded Solutions does is we aggregate data from a lot of our members, and we use that alongside Lincoln to do a study from 2000 to 2019 and really look at sort of what folks' experience was. And we found that not only was the foreclosure rate extremely low, less than 1%, even through the Great Recession, but folks were building wealth, and I think 59%, I think it was, ended up going on to taking that and having enough to make a down payment on a traditional home. So it really is kind of creating these middle rungs of the ladder, right? This middle ground that Paul describes, to be able to have folks move from renting into a different form of ownership and then into traditional ownership if that's what they choose.
Fantastic. Devin, this makes me think of what I'm trying to formulate a question that can mash up all of these great ideas between the bunch of you. And we've been talking again as ownership as a tool. And you have a bunch of rental housing, with rent restrictions expiring. You've got co-op models that Paul and others. You've got community land trust. You've got shared equity. Is there something that could be done much bigger with all of you together in some sense to move more rental housing into ownership, and might that be a way to deal with some of the expiration of some of these rent restrictions? So there, you all can take a shot at that.
Yeah, if that's to be to start, I think, we definitely encourage our member organizations to not try and be sort of a one-trick pony or a single deal type organization. So we really encourage folks to do the homeownership work, but also think about holding a rental portfolio to kind of balance themselves and provide some revenue. So that's something that's been increasing incrementally, and it still is under the community governance that Jazmin described. So there's still sort of a strong mission component, but an ability to move some of those units. And sometimes we're talking about the expiring year 15 deals that are a little bit larger. Sometimes it is those 2 to 4 plexes, some of those smaller units that are the right sweet spot for a community-based organization and provide a lot of benefit to community, but aren't really the target of some of the larger groups.
In two words, oh, pardon me, Michael, after you.
Thank you, Paul. I was going to say the same thing. I think you're right, David. It's like an all of the above approach. Our focus has obviously been on the rental side of it. And one of the key components when you deal with rentals to address kind of some of the other concerns that have been raised about private equity shops and larger Wall Street organizations who aren't maybe mission aligned with your communities, right? Or with what you're trying to do as investors is to make sure that the mission alignment is there. And, I started out in commercial banking, probably like a lot of people on the call, and knowing your customer and character was one of the big C's, right, of lending, and that's really important. So, and that you can't put a number on that, but it's part of, I think, how we do business and how we work across communities. You do have to pick your partners well, right? And that's a soft skill. So I say that's part of it, and then the other part of it is, as I alluded to. All of the above do apply. We would welcome opportunities to do deals that aren't traditional rental structures. If we could find the right scale to have it be repeatable. One of the challenges we face in bringing institutional capital in, that they'll do 30, $3 million deals because it's about $100 million and they can put a program out there and they can spend some time on it. But doing one $3 million deal is really, really hard given all the constraints they have on their time. And so the challenge that we face in working with a number of the partners that are on the call is developing that scale and repeatable structure that we can then bring capital to. And so I think I've heard a lot of great, really, helpful, and I think really good things that are going on. We would love to do more of it. It's just a challenge from our perspective.
Yeah. Paul?
In 2 words, David, tax policy. I think we could definitely expand the number of investors looking to lay off assets into the affordable housing, permanently affordable housing, community development space. If we really worked hard at tax policy, rumors of a tax bill in 2025. I know our friends at Lafayette Square are working on some tax policy. We have 3 U.S. senators sponsoring a bill for a capital gains tax break to community investors that sell to limited equity cooperative and nonprofit buyers in our space. But I think there's a lot that could be done on the tax policy side. And then, up for the creative minds and genius on the call and other places to put the capital together to meet the market where it's at.
Well, just to stick on with you, Paul, because co-ops makes me think of, sort of New York buildings that go co-op and turn renters into owners. I know, that has multiple, there's lots of nuance in all of that. But is that something that it can be used more broadly for rental housing to become co-ops? There wouldn't be mobile home co-ops, but
correct.
Yeah.
Yep. And there is movement afoot there. Our good friends at UHAB, Urban Homesteaders, are scaling the work they've been doing in small and medium-sized multifamily that are transitioning to co-ops. So there's some good work being done by some bright minds there. Certainly, you've got the National Co-op Bank, which is a huge financier of cooperative buildings and cooperatives of all sorts. So I think more could be done. We've seen a little bit of grassroots activity on that front. But the big capital is really and the scaling initiatives, National Co-op Bank and UHAB, from my vantage point. Michael?
Yeah, Paul, I just wanted to follow up because you mentioned tax policy. And I think one of the ways, particularly for cooperatives and not-for-profits is clarity at the local government level on property taxes and how you can get property tax abatements or pilot programs. We finance a number of properties with nonprofits who have to go through hurdles just to get basic things like a property tax pilot or an exemption, which is their right in many cases, right? In a lot of locations, it's a right as of right, but getting it can be the challenge. And so simple tax policy, clarification or making the process easier would make the lives of, all these cooperatives and not-for-profit community development associations a lot easier. And you'd be surprised. Property taxes in particular can really be a challenge for smaller developments.
Well,
Yeah.
as it happens, Mike, we've got Hank Levy, who's the tax collector in Alameda County, where I pay my taxes. And he's put several interesting ideas. One, using some of the tax challenge properties for affordable housing, but he also lofted a question about, is anyone considering reverse mortgages as one possible tool to maintain home ownership? I know there's been issues with reverse mortgages. Is that anything that you all
I
work
mean,
with? Ruth?
we've seen some research on that as well, and depending on the person issuing the mortgage and how it has been, there's been a lot of extractive practices there, and so there's room for disruption and I think rethinking and going back to the policy piece. And I think there's a lot that we can do to challenge the status quo, right? And looking at a lot of homeowners continue to pay property taxes, but because they don't have clear title, don't enjoy tax abatements, the benefits of that. And so how can we offer other ways to provide tax abatements to heirs property holders? And also just, I think one thing that I'd like to add is just, we're looking for cross-sector collaboration. This is not something that one sector can solve on its own. And these issues are really broad reaching, and we need to get policy, government actors, HFAs, HUD, all of these actors kind of involved to move capital. So, yeah.
Hank pops in that he's not the assessor, so we understand that. Jazmin, it looked like you had a comment, and I want to give each of you a chance for sort of a closing thought. We're at the hour, so if folks have to jump off, obviously do, but we're going to go a couple more minutes.
I would just add, I think the role of the public sector is so critical to bring here. There's a lot of our partners in LA in particular were able to leverage some of the infrastructure dollars to create a LA acquisition and rehab pilot project here in LA that allowed for some of the community land trusts to acquire existing low income housing and continue to preserve it into a community land trust model. So I think I would just highlight the idea that no size fits all, that these projects are very unique to the local communities. But I think really pushing all of us and challenging all of us to think outside of the box and thinking outside of the traditional models that are leaving so many people behind. So how can we, in our roles in the different sectors that we represent, really think of innovative ways, the ways that we haven't seen? How do we really tap into our creative juices to be able to make capital and resources available to communities that would otherwise access to nothing else?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Final thoughts from each of you. I'm agnostic about the order you want to go in. So anybody who's ready.
I'll step in, David, and just say what's really exciting me. Just out with you in Denver at the Assemble 100, and Tony from Grounded Solutions was there.
John and Ida Rademacher is all over the chat here. Thank you.
Ida's here from Aspen Institute, and of course John Green from Black Stability Fund was there. And what's got me super excited, having been in the community development space for a long time, is the maturing of the strategies to bulk and portfolio purchases and deconsolidation. In our adult lives, we've only heard about a consolidating U.S. economy, and it is just really exciting to me. And broadening wealth gap. That's the other thing we've we've all experienced since the Reagan administration. So let's be clear, right? We've got to step up and deconsolidate and remove these properties from the speculative real estate market and get them in the hands of local community, whatever that might mean to the various strategies. But I think it's exciting to be a part of and to see the innovation and impact investors meeting us where we're at, which is really fun.
I love it. Deconsolidation. I just put the hashtag in the chat there.
Yeah, thanks for raising a Symbol 100, Paul. I was thinking similar, because some of the things that are coming out of that are really thinking about bringing some of these organizations and these efforts closer together to get to some of the capital scale and investment scale that Michael was talking about. I mean, Jazmin, you raised the role of the public sector in terms of bringing some subsidy. They also have access to some of the best capital costs in the, in the known universe, right? And so being able to get things to the scale where you can facilitate bond issuances and things like that, I think there's a lot that we can do together to sort of get beyond the our CDFI partners who we know and love and are so critical to all of our work, but are in a certain scale range that we need to ultimately transcend if we're really making this an option for enough people.
Great. Just to clarify for folks what people are talking about, Assemble 100 was a gathering a few weeks ago in Denver with the Gary Community Ventures, the Aspen Institute, and Bridgespan that brought together a lot of these threads of ownership across home ownership, employee ownership, community ownership, and even financial asset ownership. And it was really exciting to see that disparate initiatives come together like that. I think Ruth or Michael?
David, just to wrap up, really interested in the conversation and a lot of the work that's going on. Where we sit, or at least where I sit many times, we don't engage a lot on the asset level or the community level in quite the same way that the other panelists are today. And so it's really helpful. And I think everyone on the call should be really thankful to hear about the different efforts and kind of how they weave together. As I said, it's like let's do all of the above kind of approach, but every community has a little bit different need set. And it's really interesting that we're able to swap those stories and work together. It's really encouraging. I'm coming away with it kind of motivated, more motivated than I was coming in. So thank you.
Yeah,
Terrific. And I think what Impact Community Capital brings is this institutional scale perspective, and as the community solutions bubble up and the institutional money comes down, maybe there's a meeting in the middle of that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I want to echo those sentiments and just say, we're excited to be a part of this moment in this movement to elevate these issues and bridge the capital and the solutions. And so we just really invite foundations to participate in any way that they see and to collaborate with others and with impact investors and to continue the conversation. And so I really appreciate being part of this. Thank you.
Terrific. And just on that point, which is a great jumping off point, our work with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is all over these kinds of issues, in particular this home ownership preservation as a specific topic, but also more broadly wealth and health building in communities and bringing investable opportunities so that the capital can flow as well. So thank you, Ruth, and your whole team over there. Dennis, any last thoughts to you, and then we'll let folks go on to their rest of their days.
No, it just we never got to the question, but I'd love to come back around to like how we've mentioned some policy, but how does it? We hear from the potential Harris administration around a big push around a national level push around housing. So that could be exciting, and I'd be keen to learn how folks are going to plug into that. But for the next call.
And Paul queued us up with the tax fight to come. And opportunities to plug in there. So we'll be all over that as well on the policy front. So thank you to all of you panelists, of course, but also thank you to all of you agents of impact in the chat. There's just tremendous talent and resources there, which we'll round up in our post on Friday, along with a video replay of this call. So tell your friends and colleagues they can get it all. As Zulema would want me to remind you, if you're not a subscriber to Impact Alpha, go ahead and sign up. If you want just the teaser taste, there's the free open impactalpha.com/open, and that will give you a little flavor of what we do every day and every week. So thank you all, and we'll see you on the next call.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, everyone.